Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the GovTech Week. Thanks for tuning in for the third day of an international 5-day online conference that explores the widths and depths of GovTech topic. Today, we are talking about how data and technologies can help us solve our biggest policy challenges. How can it help us understand our cities without undermining the citizens? How neurotechnology could figure out the intricacies of the most pressing societal challenges. These and other questions will be discussed in today's keynote discussions and a fireside chat. Just to remind you all, throughout the week and throughout today, you will hear different keynotes, presentations, and showcases of solutions. Some will be broader and will concern the big picture, some will be about specific technical solutions for the government. Although we invite you to join the whole week, please find what interests you the most on govtechweek.com and join at those times. Although most of the questions for the panel discussions have been already gathered from a wide range of stakeholders, please use the chat to network with other individuals joining the conference. But let's dive into the topic and start with a very exciting presentation, How Does the City Beat? Understanding the City Through Data, with Natalia Grau, Marketing Manager at City Beats. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Hello everyone, thank you for having us today. I'm Natalia Rao, Marketing Manager at City Beats. We are very excited to be presenting at the GovTech Week on behalf of City Beats to talk about the advancements that the use of artificial intelligence has been making in the areas of public policy, decision making, and social impact projects. We hope we will bring some light on how AI can help and impact on citizens' life. Just a little background on who we are. City Beats is a social data platform based on artificial intelligence with natural language processing and machine learning proprietary algorithms. And what we do is to transform people's opinions at scale into data that decision makers can use to solve problems faster. And today we'll be talking about what it means to make data more human, what we define as ethical AI, and how we achieve it, plus some use cases. But first, we'd like to talk about data. We know that the exponentially growing reliance on data doesn't need to be explained here, but from our observations, data is to rely on numbers, things that are easy to measure, but we know that the humans, our voices, our opinions are not easy to measure. To capture human data, we need insights on text, and this is scary for a lot of institutions because how do you get clear data from text? Opinions are subjective and not easily measured in the way that we are used to. And this is why CityBeats created our ethical AI platform. We like to compare it to a tool much like a social microscope would work that lets governments and institutions analyze what people are saying and develop actionable insights. So, where does human-centered data come from? If you think about that, on Twitter alone there are over 500 million tweets shared every single day. The internet and social media are designed to give people a platform to express themselves. So what we do at CityBeats is use the power of AI to collect public opinions by connecting to public sources like social media and other data sources provided by our clients like call helpline transcriptions, CRMs, chatbots, and so on. The advantages of the automated social data collection for decision makers are several. Usually when organizations want to get a feel for public sentiment, they turn to traditional methods like polls or surveys, but from a time and cost standpoint, collecting feedback and analyzing the data for results can take weeks and is costly. Because AI works in real time, both time and cost are greatly reduced, especially in situations that are in constant fluctuation, like now with COVID, where circumstances change weekly, if not daily. Real-time and data becomes even more valuable. Also, because surveys require so much work and budget, they are limiting in terms of geographical coverage. A survey might cover up to a handful of cities at most, while AI can easily include hundreds of cities just as easily. Another important advantage is that the results come directly from the people. There are no preset questions like you will find in a poll or survey, so you will get insight into topics you may not even know were an issue. This not only lets public policy decision makers help find solutions to problems that are most relevant to the population, but can help them to take preemptive measures on topics that come up and can be addressed before they become local issues. Before we move on to some use cases of the impact of AI technology for the decision-making process, we'd like to address an important topic, and that's the issue of AI and ethics. According to some, AI is so potentially powerful that there's no way to machines aren't spying on us and having any regard for our personal privacy. It is a valid concern, and we take the issue of the ethics very seriously. The way that we ensure that we are delivering on the ethical promise is by strictly adhering to 5 principles. The first one is the respect for privacy. All the data analyzed are extracted from public and open sources, social networks, blogs, digital press, websites, or from private sources that have permissions to use this data. Another one is the interpretation of collective data, not individual. CDBits analyzes collective data, which means that it works with aggregated data. By working only with a large amount of anonymized data and collective opinions, it never detects the opinions of specific individuals. Individuals are always anonymized, and including collectives and global trends are analyzed, so the objective is not to detect individual cases. Another one is the identification of deviations. The platform identifies the discrepancies caused by social demographic factors such as gender, age, etc. And another one is the use for positive social impact. CDBits always spots a platform at the service of projects with a positive impact on people's lives. And the last one is non-partisan application. The platform never works for ideas, parties, or political movements, but works for administrations and institutions, NGOs, non-profit entities, and other decision makers. Now let's get into some use cases that we have collected from projects around the world. We'll go through a few of the projects that we worked on 2019 in Latin America, the Caribbean, Spain, Dublin, and Japan. This focus of these projects range from citizen engagement to social inclusion, to disaster mitigation, and to regulation and consumer protection. The first case we'll look at this is a citizen engagement project in Dublin, in which we partnered with Smart Dublin, which is part of the Dublin City Council. The challenge was that the councils were trying to find new ways to understand people's opinions at scale about rapidly changing social issues. Slow methods were being used, like sensors to monitor air contamination and traffic congestion. To get civic feedback, surveys were the main tools used, but again, this took time and were expensive. At the highest level, Smart Dublin has been transforming the qualitative feedback collected into quantitative indicators of top priorities, the leading of which are homelessness and housing. And the Council is reporting this in the Dublin Economic Monitor, placing innovative social indicators alongside traditional economic indicators such as GDP. The collected information has also been used tactically as input for decisions ranging from controversial investment issues to the improvement of public spaces like adding designated bike lanes. Next, we have a social inclusion project for which we collaborated with Fundación 11, Spain's leading NGO for representing people with disabilities. And the challenge was giving a voice to vulnerable groups and excluded groups when it comes to decision about public spending and infrastructure design. There is a great diversity of needs among people with disabilities, from physical to cognitive to auditory disabilities, that should be taken into account when creating inclusive and accessible cities. However, there is a growing opportunity for this population to share their personal experience with inaccessible infrastructure online. Automatically collecting and structuring this information can, for the first time, provide rich quantitative and qualitative evidence for identifying improvements to accessibility barriers. For this project, CityBits developed a real-time accessibility map of Spain. This map identifies and synthesizes relevant complaints made by people with disabilities and others around them who became sensors of accessibility barriers. With this approach, Fundación Once has been able to capture temporally relevant needs, such as the request to make national elections more understandable for people with cognitive disabilities, and geographically specific needs, such as areas where e-scooters park on sidewalks were limiting access for people with reduced mobility. These human stories, as well as qualified evidence of issues, support advocacy with companies, local and regional government. This next project came as a result of severe floods that hit the east coast of Spain in September 2019 after a series of heavy rains called Gota Fria. The floods caused 7 deaths, plus damage to over 5,000 hectares of land, affecting 30,000 people and 190 million euros in personal property damages. And as flooding events become more frequent as a result of the climate change, governments need to find ways to plan for wide-scale investment to make regions at risk more prepared. In order to effectively support such a considerable national investment, better data is needed at the local level to understand how and where the priorities for reinforcement are. In the last few years, big data has begun to be used to inform a disaster response. One of the leaders in this field is Telefónica's Luca Big Data for Social Good. And by partnering with us, the Telefonica team was able to use their mobile phone data to map out change mobility patterns and take it a step further by cross-referencing data that CityBits brought to the table, which was social media data that included valuable assets like photos, damage types, requests, and the ability to geolocate the source with high level of accuracy. This approach led to highly focused and effective guidance for local and national organizations in their disaster relief efforts. We got involved with a very interesting project in Japan by partnering up with Entity Data, one of the Japan's leading data communication companies. The challenge addressed here was the overall difficulty of drawing actionable conclusions from online customer complaints. Since all customer-centered communication moved online via social media and health forums, all complaints and dissatisfaction gets vented out on these online channels. Every day, Japanese consumers are expressing thousands of complaints about hundreds of different products and companies across hundreds of online platforms, but there was no efficient process in place to make sense of it all, let alone provide solutions. The approach taken here was to draw on entities' data, strong data partnerships in Japan to collect consumer complaints across channels, and then use configured CityBits algorithms to analyze them for insights, such as the types of goods being mentioned, associate products and companies, and geographic regions to which the complaints are referring. And this results in an early warning system which regulators can use as a real-time monitor of emerging consumer protection issues. With this data, regulators can react faster to launch investigations or take actions to prevent the spread of health issues before they affect more consumers. The COVID pandemic, being so global and ever-changing by nature, is a good example of how a platform that analyzes people's opinions at scale and in real time can bring a lot of valuable to organizations that are trying to keep up and try to provide aid in ever-shifting situations. Here we talk about a little project that we work on, the Inter-American Development Bank Group. The project is named Civic and was developed as a citizen perception observatory that analyzes and processes millions of opinions on the internet to listen and support citizens, governments, and the private sector in finding answers to the needs of specific regions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the data is publicly accessible and is presented by topic in interactive graphics for easy understanding. The data collected from Twitter, online comments via forums, chats, and blogs was divided into categories as seen here. Categories such as crisis measures, food security, household and business economy, the new normal, education, and more. We found that at the onset of generated a significant volume of concerns about public health in the region, up to 30% of the total conversation in March. But as the months have passed, we see a diversification of the themes. Now the pandemic affects to the lives of citizens in mixed ways. For example, in Caribbean countries, the Black Lives Matter movement spurred rampant criticisms of police inequality, while in South American countries, we observe growing unrest in the mental health category as commentary about anxiety and depression became more prominent. Regions and individual countries show varying issues that needed to be brought to light for local decision makers to prepare for and handle. The real-time nature of data analysis has proven to be extremely valuable. For example, on April 12th, Civic detect a 350% increase in testimonies about hunger in Venezuela, shortly after the announcement of 30 quarantine days. The press reported on this information 2 weeks later. We are still collecting and analyzing results, but as you can see, this social data can be very valuable to organizations who are seeking to develop policies and initiatives for unprecedented conditions. And with this information, there is at least the start of a roadmap where before there was none. I'd like to thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. I hope we've been able to shed a positive light on the ways that artificial intelligence is making an impact on public policy guidance and development. And please feel free to visit our website for more information about our work, and we invite you to sign up for our newsletter for ongoing updates about our global projects. And thank you very much.
Natalia provided an amazing overview about how we can understand the city through data. Let's explore this even further in our next discussion, exploring the use of data for urban planning. For the discussion, we have 5 field experts who will be presented by the moderator Donatas Baltrushaitis from Bauland.
I will be moderating this discussion with the theme, very specific, delicate, trendy theme, exploring the use of data for urban planning and its various applications. I myself, I am an architect, urban planner myself, and I also have done and I'm still working on several projects which include that. But let's conclude what this discussion will be about. I would like to structure it into 3 parts. firstly starting from theory, trying to understand what big data means for everyone, and how urban planning in theory can achieve some certain goals for successful cities, and what does maybe United Nations say about that, and personal thoughts. The second part, to my view, would be quite useful to share our experiences, your field of work, your projects, what you're already working on, and if you would introduce them, how successful and non-successful, or maybe where to develop further. And the last part, I think it is essentially important to give already recommendations for everyone who is watching us, and to actually try to spread the knowledge, because personally I believe the knowledge is at its best when it's shared and when it goes open source. So hello everyone again, and maybe each of you, starting from Nicole Kirova, could introduce. Let's make an introduction round. So briefly, a bit about each oneself, and then we will start with the theory part.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Nicole. It's
Hi,
really
Nicole.
a pleasure to be here. So I think my experience in urban data is quite limited, in the sense that I'm a designer and an architect, and currently I'm more into the research field. So I'm doing my PhD into material research for 3D printing and sustainable materials. But one of the projects that I worked on for quite a while was trying to explore alternatives for harvesting pedestrian data, and especially, moving from tracking to sensing, and how we can sort of start involving surfaces as sensors in the urban environment. Um, it is on pause currently, but I was working on that for about 2 years and a half. And I managed to discuss quite a lot about it with different specialists in the field. So I think I would be sharing mostly their feedback on my work.
Hey, that sounds really interesting. I can't wait to hear further about that. And we also have here today Alex Berg. Maybe would you like to introduce yourself and to share a few words about you and your work?
I am a researcher at MIT's Media Lab's City Science Group. So my research focuses on the science of cities, and I do use a lot of big data. And our focus on using big data is to do so in ways that we can really extract a lot of utility from this data while preserving the privacy of the individuals who share their data. That's a really big focus of my research. And when we look at big data, we look at it as a tool that can serve policymakers by helping them make decisions and bring more people to the table with more knowledge. And we look to help people make community-based decisions by sharing knowledge, which seems like your focus as well.
Amazing. Sounds really exciting. Uh, Especially when it's already being applied, these kind of things.
Yeah, and our research has recently focused on something that is similar to Nicole's work, which is the focus of using mobility data in particular to contend with the COVID crisis, because so much transmission is related to mobility.
Yes.
So
Yes.
understanding how we can extract that type of information to help people understand the transmission of disease while also preserving the privacy of individuals has been our recent focus.
That's extremely useful, especially in today's situation. How should we move safer? Okay, extremely excited. And let's hear from our third guest, Jacopo Hirstein. Could you share a few words with us? What do you do?
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm Jacopo. I am a co-founder of Techia, which is a data analysis and data visualization company based in London. My background is in architecture. So long time ago, I studied architecture in Venice. Then I was working as an architect and then as an urban designer in a few different places, including Austria and London. And then at some point, my career path has changed a little bit. I started to code, and then I started to apply what I knew before regarding data analysis and planning with code and with big data. So since I started to be able to handle big data sets and do some analysis on that, then I really saw that there were a lot of new words and a lot of new dimensions opening. And that helped us to structure the business here. And basically what we do now is creating tools and analysis to advise urban designers or local governments or any type of organization that has some need to gather insights from their data or from data that is publicly available. And this is what we do.
It's indeed, I think we're lucky that there is software and that computers can manage this kind of data. In our heads, supposedly, this kind of huge information wouldn't fit at all. That's the new reality we're dealing with. And again, yes, indeed, without certain algorithms and how to cope with data, how to actually extract the essential points, that's a big thing and a big part of it all. Thank you. Can't wait to hear further thoughts of you. And let's give a few words for Saule Gabriele, who is co-founder of GovTech Lab. And thank you for gathering us all here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Saule, and yeah, I am a co-founder of GovTech Lab, but currently I'm not working there anymore since I shifted to a new project. So you're welcome. But I think soon I gathered all of us here. But of course, they asked about the topic and about people that we would like to see here. So I just randomly throw everything into there, and I'm very happy to see you all here. I'm personally, I worked as an architect, and then I spent some time in the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. And there was a place where I met technologies for urban planning, and one of those are data analysis, data visualization, and applying data for urban planning. So I did some academic projects being there. After that, I came back to Lithuania, and I worked for GovTech Lab. We established GovTech Lab, as well as I did some open data projects here in Lithuania, because we still have these problems, if you can call so, of being not that open, the government as it should be. And one of the reasons why I was always advocating for open data was because it's useful also for urban planning. And let's open as much data as possible. And one of the use cases could be here in city planning and city management. So together with GovTech Lab, one of our targets were also city municipalities, not only to use technology, but also to use the data that they have. And one of the fields is also data planning. And I'm very happy because today I also started a workshop at the university, at our university here in Vilnius, and we are here with the topic of Vilnius nightlife. We have a goal to teach students to map the data, and they are doing this for the very first time. And I'm really curious how it will work out, but I think it's very important to start learning it here. I heard like people are doing this in foreign countries, in other universities, but here in Lithuania, it's still, in Vilnius, it's still a very new thing, and a thing that is usually made by some programmers and coders, but never heard about among architects. So I think we're here at the shifting point.
Cannot agree more. I think we're all here more or less pioneers. This is a completely undiscovered huge tool that we can actually shape our environments for the better. And yeah, amazing initiatives. And I myself want to share that yeah, it's actually great to see the actual use of data planning. I work myself for on Lithuanian Comprehensive Territorial Plan Vision, and we actually gathered also a lot of data. But the thing is that it is really still scarce on the national level, especially if you want to use the data in planning, in urban planning. It has to be not through juridical boundaries, but actually per plots, and that's already a very different kind of data. Anyway, let's move back to you guys. So a bit of maybe let's connect already theory with practice. I think it will be more interesting, but let's touch both of them. So I have a quote for you, which comes to me all the time when I start thinking about the new technologies or smart cities or all the high-tech things that connects the cities. So we have the technology, right? But what was the question? There's a lot of new technologies going on, happening around, and we really want to use them all. But what is the question that we want to answer? So maybe each of you can try to answer what is your personal question that you're trying to answer using big data. And before that, yeah, it is really essential to to engage uh, to engage neighborhoods and citizens with all of its use. But again, what's your personal question that you're trying to answer? Let's start in a sequence that maybe we, or who raises a hand. I think Alex has an answer.
Sure. I have a few different projects where we had a few questions and used big data to have a few answers. So a bit more about my background, just because other people commented on their relationship with coding and data scientists. I have a background in math and computer science, and I worked for several years as a software engineer, most recently at Google, using a lot of big data from Google Search. And now I am a researcher, again, using big data in the form of mobility data from telecoms, as well as open public data sets. So your organization reached out to me due to one of my projects that used big data from city bike share networks, as well as census data, or data that is collected from the government about the demographics of the population. And this question that this project was trying to answer was, so in the United States, we have different bike share systems where there are docked bikes in different neighborhoods, and individuals can subscribe to these bike share networks and take a bike between these different docks. And this is a wonderful way to increase access to transit, where, say, maybe more traditional transit like train lines and bus lines do not reach. So the question here was whether the placement of bike share docks was equitable. A lot of times in the United States, people might associate bikes with white people or privileged people. And our question was whether where these bike docks were being placed, which is what increases access to mobility and limits where people can go, because at the end of using one of these bikes, you need to dock it at one of these locations, whether that placement was equitable. So this was really more of a data visualization project where we were overlaying the placement of these bike docks over the demographic information about the cities. Anyone that's listening can look this up by just Googling income race bikes. That is the project title. And we use data from a few different cities in the United States. And what this project, what this information shows is a few years into the bike share system deployment, the placement of these bike share docks might be a bit equitable, but it doesn't usually start that way. Usually where these bike share docks start is in the more affluent or whiter neighborhoods. So that was a question that we attempted to answer with data and could continue expanding with more data and more cities.
Super interesting. Yeah. Bikes are, I guess, for all of us, with no doubt, very healthy and very, very nice transport mode, which we are rediscovering, I might say, after the automobiles. And especially if tech can answer also more questions as related with social inequalities, that's incredibly nice goal. Thank you for sharing this. Who else has an answer to the question?
Well, maybe
Nicola?
I can,
Nicole.
yeah, just jump on that first
Sure,
of
of
all,
course.
because just a thought on bikes. I don't have a driving license, and I've been going around with the bike ever since I had to, go larger distances. So yay, bikes. They're kind of, I think they're a very human way to travel around cities and a very inclusive way, especially I would say in Europe or in my past experience. But going back to the question, I think that what technology tries to answer for me personally in an urban scale is how we can sort of create more ecological, more human-centered, and more resilient cities. And I mean, that was the first premise that I started going in when I thought, okay, I have all these new tools that I was introduced in IX, so in the Institute of Advanced Architecture in Catalonia, where for me the whole like technological sort of rediscovery happened from traditional architecture to whatever weird stuff I'm doing right now. So then I thought, okay, I have all of these new tools and I really want to figure out how to use them for, for the better, let's say, in the most generic way. And then for me, the better sort of answered in a more human-centric, design practices. And I really think that over time, this has grown even more. Currently, I started asking myself, how are all of these big data initiatives helping smaller cities? So, of course, we usually deal with data where we have it available. And a lot of the smart cities that that are really developed would be, let's say, Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Berlin or even Barcelona. And then, of course, in the States, we have New York, LA, or really big and very well-developed cities. But how can we extract principles or practices from these cities and take them to less developed areas? So I come from Bulgaria, and especially from a very small town, which is sort of on the border between Romania and Serbia. It's on a very strategic geographic location, but in the past 15 years, the density, which in other cities is kind of a problem that we're trying to deal with data, for us, it's the opposite. So the density has been dispersing quite a lot. And I think this is an example that, it's not one city, it's pretty much everywhere besides the megapolises. So something that I think should be investigated a little bit more in the future is how these big data practices can really help sort of balance out densities.
How to control uncontrolled urban sprawl and questions like this, I guess.
Exactly. To go more into even bigger from city to a region maybe. So, you know, like we tend to reach the limit of a city scale, and this is already quite impressive, but you know, the city does have impact on smaller regions around it, or on villages and small towns, etc. So I think we should scale up even a bit more, I think.
Yeah, that's a nice one. Scalability, especially for these technologies, is essential. Yeah, I personally have worked with data that you can apply to different scales. There's regional scales, national scales, like, yeah, again, town scale. And then with all this data, when you find the right question, then you might find the right answer in this data. Very nice insights. Question of a question to Saule. What's your question that you want to answer? I think you mentioned it already, but you can elaborate.
To answer your question, I think I would like to go a little bit from more wider scale than going about one particular topic that we could answer or not.
Yeah.
For me, going into all these data things was because when I studied and did some classical urban planning projects, for me it was always the question is, why do we design things not based on a lot of I don't know how to say, not data driven, if you can call so, because we were doing nice designs and nice looking areas and creating some interesting functions. I'm talking about urban planning at university, but I was always wondering, is there a scientific proof of what we are doing here, and can we prove what this place needs, and what can we do this place to be successful and visited by people, and what can we do so that life happens over there and it's not just empty and just nice empty visualizations with hot air balloons. And for me, I couldn't answer this question when I was at my former previous university. So I went to study this city and technology thing. And what I learned that there were tools hundreds years ago, like first I think Serdar started doing this like 150 years ago. He was already measuring and calculating things in terms of urban planning when he wanted to do expansion of Barcelona. But yeah, he was doing it in old school way, analyzing a lot of papers and everything. And then there was Jan Gehl, who was doing this 40, 50 years ago, also with hand going and calculating people in Italian plaza, and seeing what makes people to be in one particular place, what makes them to like that place, what makes life to happen there. And I think data is just a new tool, that like the data that we talked today about is just a new tool in order to analyze the space and in order to understand what do people do. And I think for me, it was the most interesting question, not how place looks like, but what to do there and how to make it wanted to stay in that particular public space or area of development. So for me, data can answer many different questions, whatever is your topic. But one of the main questions for me was how to make life happen between buildings, if you can call so.
It's very excellent insights. Actually, the question of a question belongs to Serdar. He asked it in 1962. I think I'm correct. Yeah, it's actually the essential part, I guess. When we have a lot of data, we can interlap it and see which places to relate that kind of data with where people live happily, where people need something, where people lack something, and by overlapping this kind of sets can really help as additional strong tool, not to create ghettofied communities, social inequalities, and so on and so on. It's very similar answers for me as well. Okay, Jacopo, are you there?
So yeah, for us, the questions vary based on each different project, but mainly regarding urban design, It's either how to improve a place that is already existing, and the other one is how to make sure that the design of a place that is going to be built in the next 20 years is actually built with the right assumptions. And that includes understanding how, well, the complexity of a place, not only from local knowledge, but through really the behavior of the city itself. And that includes a lot of different dimensions, movement, economics, employment. And we feel that with the analysis of data sets that include these dimensions, we can provide insight on how the place works now and make a model or try to articulate some assumptions on how this can grow in a sustainable way. We've seen in the past many successful examples of new towns, but also towns that don't work very well. So what we hope that is happening in the future is that we can use the technology that we have available to help moving in a better direction. And regarding what we do with the places that need improvement, one project that we did recently was for the Global Institute of Innovation Districts, which is a network of areas around the world that have a strong academic or business direction. And they are very dense with businesses and academics that do research, and they collaborate between each other. And usually these places are very walkable. And so one aspect that we analyzed for these districts was really the walkability aspect, which is actually something that after the pandemic is more and more relevant. A lot of people move by walking more than our cities need to be more walkable. Finally, we recognize that. And in order to understand how walkable are the streets, we looked at a 24-hour period, and we analyzed data from mobile data from applications to understand how dense the various areas of the cities are. We looked at in-betweenness, so how the network of streets are structured, what are the most logical paths for residents and businesses and people to use. We looked at green spaces, street furniture, traffic, and what we tried to do was creating
everything.
Creating a model with and where each dimension has a weight that we also tested with someone on site, which provided to us a model that can be scaled up to other areas in the cities or in other places. And we found that studies that deal with this are super interesting and always offer some indication for improvements, or just by taking in account of what actually works at the moment, and highlighting also like what can be improved at the same time.
There's a very interesting point that you tackled, because actually to really get to know the whole context. Technology is does it provide answers like the big data, or does it give insights? That was a big question to me, because if it seems that if big data gives direct answers, we're no longer needed as human beings, right? So that's a very nice point that you said, that it gives insights, because otherwise we wouldn't be in control ourselves of our future environments. And that's a very large, interesting aspect. And to finalize, like maybe I see that Alex, you wanna give some comments. Okay, shoot, and then I will have the last question to all of you guys. Yeah.
I want to play devil's advocate and disagree. I don't think that having data answer questions removes the need of humans. I think that the most difficult thing to do as researchers is find what the right questions are to ask. And that is a very human, task. And we can use data and use human understanding of what insights we can take from that data.
Oh yeah, that was my point. But
to then do the analyses to answer good questions.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Maybe you misunderstood me. Like
I'm sorry.
I said that it doesn't give answers at all. It just gives insights, which is exactly that, I guess. Okay. Remembering, probably everyone of you have heard about very interesting project which was called Cambridge Analytica, which used big data for interesting reasons. And there is a lot of fear in societies, especially when things get gathered, especially data, privacy. And the question for you is, it's a provocation. Will big data create artificial intelligence, and where could that lead us? What are your final recommendations for actual planners, that how to systemize this data? Maybe you encountered some failures that you want to share, or mistakes that you want others not to do again, or some useful links how to extend the information for the topic, because it is still a relatively unknown theme for most of the urban planners, especially older generation. And personally, I'm also really, let's say, not afraid, but when I see huge industrial companies claiming that they're creating all sorts of smart cities, integrating all the use of the data, which is only for commercial reasons, there are some tricky parts there. Okay, so recommendations and urban planning. How can we actually use it? What are your successes, failures? Please share.
I could start. Yeah, I think you said a good point about smart cities and all this buzz around smart cities. So yeah, at least in academia world, this buzzword is no longer used. We talk about intelligent cities, but I understand there are so many people who still think that smart city is something what we need. We need all these sensors to see what's happening around, and all these surveillance cameras to let be followed, if you can also, and all these technologies to make cities smart. But I think the real smartness and intelligence comes from communities, when people are empowered by these technologies. And I think that's the next step, at least here in Lithuania, what we need to understand when we're talking about city planning, that it's not something that we'll have one technology and city municipality planning department will have it and use it in order to analyze it and make some decisions. No, it's technologies are made to have, first of all, insights, but then to enable communities and people advocate their needs and to hear their wishes about particular places and what they want to have in the city. So to do so, I think first of all, it's not just a matter of technological education. Of course, you can learn technologies and go to online courses and analyze spatial data. And like GIS is not something very new and unknown in city department of planning, city planning, they're already using GIS, ArcGIS or QGIS, and analyzing the data in one way or another. But what we really lack is the communication with communities and having maybe some technologies in order to hear community's voice. So I think first step is to go outside to the city and see what do people do and what they want. And I think there are many technologies created for that. And we have one small here in Vilnius, which is more to register your complaints about public spaces around that you see, like a parked car illegally or something like that. So you can already give some feedback to the city. So I think it's nice first step, but there are many more room to improve where we could go with the technologies.
Yeah, that's good insights. So empowering communities to actually educating them how to actually use it for their own lives, not only creating these big data sets. There's some really
I would like to add also another thing. I think there's one good project which I really like and show as an example to the students today, is the one that is made by Techia, I think by Jakob for you, the London Station Room. I think it's a very successful example because in that project, the real-time data was presented to citizens in London, how it looks like, the data, and what kind of decisions you can make with the data and what decisions are made with the data real time. I think that was a very good project because not many people have an idea of how does data look like. And I think this exposing to people what kind of data is collected by city and government is a really useful thing in order to stop being afraid of that.
Would you like to elaborate on that, maybe?
Yes, that was actually the drive to develop that project, really to put the citizen in the middle of, in that case, a room full of data coming from various sources. And really the feedback that we had from the visitors was really interesting because really, like for some, this was the first time that they realized that what they wrote on the internet was actually available to everyone. So it was an interesting experiment that really exposed our place within big data and what are the challenges that this presents, including privacy, obviously, and but also opportunities. So our location is something that our location data is something that we carry with us all the time with our mobile. We don't know it, but it is already used by a lot of different parties. So the question is, how can this be also useful for us and for the common good?
Okay, that's a nice project. Sounds scalable, I guess. I think that's one of the points that where we can learn from each other. Okay. I also maybe Nicole would like to elaborate about the Synapse system.
Yeah. So
How do you actually get the data from the bricks and what is it all about?
So that was like a big exploration that actually started from me getting familiar with nanomaterials or with graphene in particular. So I was introduced to, I was in the studio in Ajax and we could select several materials that we could work with to develop something with them. And of course, I was super fascinated. You know, you have a nanomaterial in the lab and you kind of imagine it's doing all kinds of weird stuff. Well, it doesn't really. It's a really good electrical conductor, and that's, I mean, it does have additional properties, but in the form that I was working with, it was in nanoplatelets. So it's not really pure graphene. It's like the affordable version of graphene. And me and my group mates started playing around with it and trying to explore how we can mix it to make it into something useful. And because it's carbon based and it's really hard to mix it with almost anything, it doesn't want to mix with water. It was almost unworkable, where eventually we came up with this lucky, very IAC type of fortunate event where we mixed it with something in the lab and it started blending very nicely. Eventually, we came up with a very, very powerful conductive ink. And this was a whole process that came, like, it slowly started accumulating different knowledge about this material. And I got curious about what conductive materials could do, how we could transform them into sensors, and how we could sense essentially people with them. And I came across this capacitive sensing type of sensing, which is a very let's say primitive, like very easy way of sensing capacitive objects. And humans as such, we do tend to interfere with electrodes or with things where electrical current floats. And I could create this very large matrices very fast and very cheaply as well, with graphene and with different base materials. First, I started with plastics. Eventually, it went on being embedded into wood and clay, and finally in concrete. So once I figured out that I could embed my material in concrete, which of course has an urban application as a construction material, I started thinking, how could this be scaled up in order to come up with huge surfaces where we could understand location or interference from capacitive objects. And it turned out to be a very, let's say, a very good way to cancel out noise, because I could sense only people and very small animals, let's say, but I would very easily be able to cancel out like cars or bikes or metal objects, which was great. It meant that the data that I was collecting was very specialized, and it was very, let's say, it was very useful to start coming up with geolocation of people in real time without actually, going back to the privacy concern, without collecting facial info, like, like tracking them with facial recognition or, with their phone and like GPS and or satellite data or whatever. So it was sort of an alternative. Of course, it does come with a lot of limitations, and the scalability is a big limitation, because having this sensor within our cities would mean that a big part of our infrastructure has to be replaced. And as this data is already provided by devices that we carry with us all the time, it almost seemed as just providing an alternative and trying to tackle the question, are there other ways to understand how people move in cities, or what additional information can we give them? So on top of that, I was it started coming more not only on the sensing part but on the response. Once you have this new infrastructure, could you embed different responses within it? So can we make our urban environment a little bit more engaging?
So it's more like interactive, using the technologies also to interact.
I started putting LEDs, which was the first incentive, but
Yeah.
essentially I started putting also haptic or like vibrating devices that could guide, let's say, blind people within the urban area. So it is just, sort of providing an alternative. It's not really the final solution, but
Nicole,
it's definitely...
I'm really sorry. We're a bit of keeping like the time track. It's extremely interesting. Nanotechnologies and actual use of them in public spaces with materials. I haven't heard about that. Well, not as it's a nice one. Alex, I want to ask you about more how to make social inequalities less visible. How to use big data in terms of urban planning? Through this. Through this topic. I believe you work on this field.
Yeah, I would love to speak more of that. First, I would like to build off of what both Nicole and Jacopo were talking about, of using location data that is collected from people's phones in a way that can serve as a public good, as well as preserve people's privacy, because this was the focus of the my last year of research and in my master's thesis. So I feel like I have a lot to add here. What Nicole was saying makes a lot of sense. What the kind of data that is collected by those types of sensors lacks, though, is the ability to track people. And tracking people can be very privacy sensitive, but it can also give us types of information that are really useful, such as people that go here at this time are more likely to go here at this time. And those types of relationships are what allow city planners and urban planners to create what are called origin destination matrices and allow people to better plan transit routes or just understand how different people flow through the city and which groups mingle and which don't. And that can be really useful. And so my research was about how we can use machine learning. So what I did was I used machine learning to use these big data sets that had been provided to my group from the companies that collect this type of data from smartphones to train models that can then produce synthetic data sets that have the same properties as the real data, but since they represent the mobility data of a synthetic population, they can preserve privacy. So that was one way that we use these data sets in ways that can serve the population from whom they were collected, as well as preserve their privacy. Another way was using similar types of big data collected by telecoms, as well as through smartphone apps that track people to understand how people responded to the COVID crisis. Where were the types of places that people stopped going? What was the change in the timing at which people went to these places? But more specifically, where did different groups of people start coming into contact with each other? Because that is really what relates to the spread of transmission. And we also looked at how people's mobility behavior changed and how this impacts the spread of the virus. And there are a lot of equity questions at stake here. We found that, for example, in big cities, that people with more privilege or lived in more affluent areas left the city in much higher numbers than people of lower incomes who may not have had the means to do so. So I could go on and on, but those are just a few examples.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's brilliant. I'm already in love with your work. Sounds excellent. How to actually address these kind of issues, especially with the COVID situation. And wrapping up a little bit our discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your ideas, and I hope that further collaborations can happen and continue between each of us, and all these projects. Let's share them between us. I would like to end, I guess, with one interesting thing that I myself investigated. It was the data maps of actually, well, we are in the climate change time within in the era of man, of anthropogenic era, as geologists say so. And I analyzed data of pollution and overall throughout the world, and it was dramatic results that during the peak of the crisis, the pollution really dropped by a huge percent, like twice, triple, quadruple. And when in Lithuania we think that we didn't develop the third industrial revolution, which means we don't have bigger factories. However, it still affected a lot the air locally here too. And we showed this data to local politicians, and then it directly had their attention. So this is another quite a case used to empower certain political decisions while proofing with backing by data and science. And lastly, I believe we should all try to strive for with the data to maintain natural environments in balance together with anthropogenic environments, which is, and then the question, if we manage to do that with the help of big data, then we have much bigger chances of having much more beautiful planet as we know it. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for the discussion. Have a great day, and maybe see you sometime in the future.
Let's move from cities to our brains. How can understanding how humans make decisions can help policymakers solve major policy challenges? For the next session, Arūnė Matelytė, manager of GovTech Lab Lithuania, will be talking to Dalia Bagdžiūnaitė, a PhD in consumer neuroscience, behavioral science expert who currently works on the Policy Lab project in Lithuania. Let's listen to their fireside chat called Exploring the Use of Behavioral Science and Neurotech to Understand Human Behavior and Solve Social Challenges.
Welcome to the fireside chat called Exploring the Use of Behavioral Science and Neurotech to Understand Human Behavior and Solve Social Challenges. Our everyday life is based around decision making, so is our policy. Every day, policymakers debate how to better solve our social challenges, how to ensure safety, security, health, and happiness of the citizens. Today, we will talk about this with Dalia Bagdžiūnaitė, a behavioral science and consumer neuroscience expert. She currently works within public policy innovation field by coordinating the Policy Lab project in Lithuania. Our chat will center around understanding how people make decisions, how could we better understand them using the technology, and finally, what cues it can provide to policymakers and how can they apply this to solving policy challenges. So let's start with you, Dalia. How did you come about to be interested in neurotechnology?
Hi, Arūnė, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. So consumer technology and just general decision neuroscience came into my life pretty unexpected while I was studying at Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. So I had a chance to take an elective called Neuromarketing and Consumer Neuroscience, where I was really inspired by Professor Thomas Ramsøy, who was teaching the course. And after that, I followed up the field with my PhD studies, where I had the chance to study compulsive buying with physiological and neural responses measuring tools and technologies.
Now, that sounds very exciting. I think it's still very rare to see this kind of expertise, especially in Lithuania. But let's start maybe from the beginning. And can you explain us in plain language how people make decisions? You know, there's a lot of papers in very specific academic terms that a lot of people cannot understand. But how can you explain it to everyone who listens to us today?
So I would love to have a plain answer. However, we human beings and our brain is a very complex phenomenon. But if I would be looking for my own discipline, we would follow an assumption that we human beings are not fully conscious. And so we do not take fully rational decisions. We do not follow logical thinking, and we strongly rely on emotion, habits, and different type of impulses. When I speak about conscious and unconscious processes, literature shows that we are basically driven by our unconscious processes, and only a small part of our decision-making is driven by the conscious processes. So when I use these type of terms, I use it more from the cognitive perspective. So I do not refer to the unconscious state as, for example, being fainted or sleeping. I also do not talk about the, let's say, Freud's philosophy of hidden desires or like childhood memories or childhood experiences. I speak about the threshold of our awareness. So science shows that, for example, visual stimuli, the brain can read visual stimuli in 32 milliseconds. Yet our conscious awareness is not yet there, so we are not visually perceiving those stimuli. So those processes that happen in our brain and our body are called the unconscious processes. So when we speak about decision making, I would really love to mention a theory introduced by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. It's a pretty well-known theory, and I highly suggest everyone to read their book, Thinking Fast and Slow, because it gives a very nice simplified insight into how we humans process information and how we make decisions. So in a simplified manner, we have those so-called two systems, system 1 and system 2. So system 2 is, let's say, a pilot. So if we are a plane, our system 2 is a pilot, which is controlling different buttons, making evaluations for our consequences of our behavior, and make different types of logical reasoning. System 1 is the one which is driven more by automatic processes. So there relies our emotions, our habits, our implicit memories, and science shows that most of our behavior is actually driven by the system 1, so the automatic one. So to put it in a simple way, let's say we're trying to learn to bike. So during the first days, the system 2, the pilot one, helps us to learn, like to learn new information and to learn new behaviors. Then that behaviors goes into the system 1, which then is being triggered automatically. So these type of processes and decision making help us to actually have more space for learning new things and for doing other things that we shouldn't learn them again over and over again.
Yeah, I'd like to contribute to the book recommendation because after reading that one, I've definitely got very interested in all the behavioral science, behavioral economics aspect as well. And I think that's probably one of the best kind of readings for anyone kind of looking into more popular science kind of perspective into this field. But we talked how people make decisions and maybe how more like the brain works, but where does technology come in? Because as you mentioned, you got interested into like neurotechnologies. Why do we need technology to understand human behavior if you already explained all the theory? where does technology fit in?
Yes, so if we take an assumption that we are not rational human beings and we do not take purely logical decisions, then naturally if we want to understand the behavior, it's not enough to ask people about their behavior, because they might say what they think, but that might not represent the actual drivers of their behavior. So from the neuroscience perspective, let's say emotions play a very important role in our decision making. And emotions we define not as the feelings. So emotion is something that is going on in our body and our brain in response to different things that are going on around us. And feeling is something that we put the label on. So if, for example, I meet a person I like, I might have like a brain response, as well like a body response that later on I interpret as a fear or attraction. So from my point of view, if we want to have a more complete picture of a decision making and of the actual drivers of the behavior, we need to look at the physiological and neural responses and not only investigate attitudes or opinions of the people. So here, technology can help us to actually have more implicit measures of certain drivers of our decisions and our behavior.
What kind of specific technologies or methods both are used widely, and also maybe which ones you tried using during your research?
So I would divide those methods into two types. One would be measuring body response, and another type would be measuring neural response. So the first branch of methods would be maybe called more biometric tools or biosensor-based tools, and the other type of methods would be called more like neurotechnologies. So all of them come from the medical science and has been used and is still used for diagnostic purposes, for different, trying to investigate different diseases, but had been recently adopted in more applied fields, like for instance, marketing. Body response technologies or like measures can help us understand, for example, responses coming through the eyes or through the sweat or through different emotional changes in our facial expressions. So for example, the eye tracker is the technology, basically the glasses with the camera that can help us to investigate where the person is looking at, how people process different information, if they notice something in their environment, how fast did they look at it, what they haven't noticed, and so on. Let's say a facial coding, which is usually done through the camera by recognizing different muscles in our face. So basically we have two types of muscles that reflect our emotions. It's the muscles around our mouth and our eyes can help us to identify different emotional states. So we can investigate whether the person has a positive response or negative response. And we can also even investigate different states of the emotion while the person, for example, is watching a video or is in a certain environment or even listening to the lecture. And then, for instance, skin conductance, biosensor, which helps us to measure skin conductance response, so sweat response, can help us identify the stress reaction or excitement. And that can be helpful if we want to, for example, study what type of environment makes, let's say, people work more productively, which type of, design could help cancer patients to get better treatment, and so on. When we speak about neurotechnologies, we usually talk about functional magnetic resonance, which is basically a very prominent technique in the medical field, and also electroencephalography. So functional magnetic resonance is measuring changes in the oxygenated blood flow in different brain areas. And by basically recording those changes, we can see how the person is reacting to different type of information as well, while they are in the scanner. Electroencephalography is more applied to in a realistic settings because we can put the helmet with the electrodes, and then by measuring electrical activity, we can understand different metrics such as motivation, emotion, and a propensity for action. And in that sense, we can have a better picture of the decision in a certain situation or while being exposed with different information.
So basically, if we do not trust the humans themselves to kind of recognize why they're behaving in a certain way or why they're making a certain decisions, that kind of technology can help us, as I mentioned, understand then those drivers behind it, right? Not just the surface and the decision itself, but why it came about, so that we can address not the decision, but the root causes of the decision. Yeah.
So often we also do not differentiate that much between those two types because I think they complement each other very well, because it gives more holistic picture of the human behavior, because the attitudes is also important. But as we know that sometimes people might say one thing and then do another thing. Let's say, I don't know, people often promise they will quit smoking that they never do at the end of the day. Because it's a bit stronger than just a conscious thought. It's a behavioral pattern that needs to be changed. So those type of technologies or methods help to get a better picture of the entire mechanism of a decision and not only the reasons or motivations of those decisions.
And you, of course, mentioned from your research and that you became interested in from more of a like consumer and like marketing perspective. So where, I guess, could you expand on, how is it used actually in this field and maybe like other fields that's the most prominent, because it's still quite new in most of the fields, right? It hasn't been around for very, very, very long, this kind of research.
Yes, so in the marketing field, the first experiments have been done in 1990s, but actually the field of neuromarketing and consumer neuroscience evolved only in 2002. And right now, I would say in this field, the knowledge stemming from psychology and neuroscience, and also tools coming from there, like neurotechnologies, are used to better understand consumer behavior. And it could be used for different purposes, to design better communication or like a better marketing solutions, or to also inform consumers, so for consumer protection or consumer policy purposes. Later on, this application, we call it applied neuroscience. So application basically have been adopted in different fields, such as design, nowadays architecture, ergonomics, also public policy. There are several cases of this being used in politics, and also education or other social or other cases for social good. So I really like one type of use of these technologies, and it's called consumer neurotechnologies field, where basically it's used for self-development and improvement. So for example, one of my colleagues, Morten Friis, together with Balder Onorheim, created so-called Plato Science device. So it's a helmet that you put on your head, and that can stimulate certain brain parts with the electrodes, and that can facilitate better cognitive abilities and more creative thinking during performance of the creative tasks. So there are different type of examples. There is also like another consumer neurotech device gadget called Muse, which can help you to meditate and relax and so on. Another, I think, also interesting way of using these neurotech, where with a more like a neurofeedback principles, is to treat different anxieties or also even PTSD in the soldiers, which I think it's a very nice way of using it for a social good.
I think this is kind of a good segue into talking more about like using this technology and methods to actually solving more social challenges, because as you mentioned, a lot of it has developed from the marketing or more like profit seeking perspective, but of course, as many of the tools, it can be used in different ways. So you mentioned a few examples of how it has been used to kind of understand and solve some like social issues. What do you see as kind of the main differences between using it in the private and the public sector? Because of course, I mean, the implications are much bigger if you design the whole policy based on this, rather than if you just release one ad from one company, right, based on these kind of assumptions.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think there are several like differences in those two fields. So one thing is the environment in which we run the study. So if we want to understand certain behavior, especially the brain response or body response, so we human beings, we always function, so it's never stopping. So in that sense, we really need to understand what we are measuring and in which type of environment. So when we think about the private sector, the scope of the research is much smaller. And so it's much easier to actually understand certain things, because it's much easier to design experiments in a way that you can control for certain aspects. and really understand that this response was due to this ad, or I don't know, like a product design or something like that. When we talk about more realistic setting, and especially our like society in which we have a lot of target groups, like different type of people, different types of situation, it's much more difficult to actually design the experiment and generalize to apply it in a wider scope. So as an example, I would say, I think it would be a very interesting study if instead of, I don't know, when we are setting up biplanes, instead of just drawing a line, put a helmet with the camera and also eye tracking glasses and run the study on, let's say, 40 bikers and see how they would be going around. Would they notice certain signs on the road and so on? And then, according to that, draw the lane. So it would be more intuitive for the ones that are driving as well. But in this sense, we could do that, you know, in a certain neighborhood in Vilnius, but maybe doing it in the entire Lithuania would be much more difficult because we would have to do it in each case. So I think it's more applicable in this broader sense in the smaller scopes. So if the problem is more aimed for a smaller scope, then it's more applicable. But sometimes it's more difficult to run those type of studies and generalize the findings when we talk about the complex and big problems.
I think from what I hear from you as well is that some of the urgent social challenges that are emerging, like sometimes requires a bit more urgent response, right? And this has to be very much like thought through and designed, and it cannot be kind of organized in a rushed manner, because otherwise that can have a very negative implications, right? And would kind of provide also then the policymakers kind of that just a tool saying that, you know, we use this as methods without actually designing it properly. So that's, I guess, one of the threats of trying to use all the new methods without actually properly designing them.
I also think it's very important, the goal, you know, really understanding what you're measuring, because it's more like a deductive approach rather than explorative approach. So of course, we can use it for exploration to better understand, I don't know, how people, for example, are walking around like tourists, how they are exploring Vilnius. I think it would be also an interesting study that we could actually try to figure out the attraction points by putting the eye trackers, or I don't know, like some interesting tools to measure their emotional response in different points, and then designing it accordingly. But yes, I think it's more of a deductive approach. So usually you already thought through what could be the potential things that you're looking for, and then you're running a study. And another thing that I also would like to mention is that when we speak about these new tools and innovation, especially related to the human body, human brain, we have all these questions regarding ethics, legal questions, and also society questions linked to the rights, you know, of the people and so on. And in here, I think also it's more difficult when we talk about societal use rather than like a public sector use rather than private use, because in the private sector, we already have certain rules and recommendations established so we can follow them. But I'm also very glad that organizations like OECD already started the debates and even are drawing recommendations for sustainable and responsible innovation in neurotechnologies. So it's not prohibiting, because technology by itself is not an evil. It's like how we are using it and what for we are using it. So I'm very glad that it's already in the public sector. We already have conversations about it and trying to draw recommendations instead of prohibiting, but actually giving a guidance of how to do it.
And where do you think in the future kind of the main areas, both in like the policy, you mentioned quite a few examples, but where would kind of the main hotspots where would be actually like useful, not just like trendy, but actually useful to use this kind of tools, in which policy policy areas, but not necessarily maybe policy, but just in general, around what kind of challenges and problems it could be used?
Yeah, I think that actually this field maybe could be explored more in depth in exactly like for social issues, like solving social issues. And I see, for example, like a great potential for, I don't know, testing social campaigns, because it's just like video ads or something. And the impact of those campaigns is very important, because sometimes those campaigns can change the numbers in, I don't know, let's say road safety, in how many people would wear the seatbelt, or like, or yeah, how many traffic accidents we would have at the end of the day. So I believe those tools could be used in this type of, for these type of cases as well. I really like the use of these measures and technologies and approaches in education. Because, for instance, facial coding and facial expression reading, even now, like during our conversation, we could be following the expressions and understanding each other much more better, by actually, and then rearranging the talk so it would become more interesting in the moment, So some companies are using that for the conferences, so they are experimenting with that, but it's not much used actually in the broader settings. I also like the use of these type of tools in creating more immersive museum experience. And I know in some countries, they do testing before, like in arrangement of different artworks. And in that case, actually helping more people, like fostering more people to come and visit and actually improve their cultural knowledge. Yeah. And I also actually was thinking, I would like to mention one example that was done by Vilnius municipality. And I really liked that case. So what they did a booth where basically people were entering Vilnius municipality, and through the facial expressions and also respiration and arousal measures, they were collecting so-called happiness index. So this project was done together with VGTU, and with the researchers, and I think it's still continuing. And I really like this approach of actually looking at the happiness index through the emotional states, because usually when we measure different countries' happiness index, we look at the very rational measures such as economic welfare, like stability and so on. But the actual happiness is most probably in the human being. So it's in our emotional state. So I think it gives a nice perspective and approach on top of what we actually have.
I think, and from what you were saying and expanding slightly on the ethics topic, I think you mentioned a few very distinct kind of examples. Some of them were more where you choose to participate in something, as in you choose to have more immersive that experience in the museums, and you as well, maybe not as much of a choice when you see the kind of social campaigns, but still not very invasive in the sense, while others that sometimes might be seen as more impactful, but there might be where you don't really have like when you become a participant without actually kind of consenting to being a participant, right? And this is, I guess, where the threat of these kind of powerful technologies lie, where because they can be used to understand human behavior, they can be very easily used to understand human behavior, not for happiness and solving social challenges purposes, but for more kind of malicious purposes as well, right?
Yeah, I think in here it's an interesting debate that should be maybe taken on the bigger level as well. But I also think that the society should not be so much afraid of technologies, because sometimes we are afraid of what we don't know, and it's, of course, it can have its own consequences, the way you were saying, like in China, it's used for citizen monitoring. And I think in that sense, there is again an ethical question of like, how far can we go and how much of intrusive it is. And I think it calls for debates, and also not only debates within the entire like sector, but also in each country, most probably, because it depends also on the citizens' will of like them wanting to be tracked or not wanting to be tracked, or like, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the cultural norms of the
Yes.
country as well. And just kind of to start to finish off, how do you think we can start these debates and kind of accelerate them? How we can kind of make that conversation more lively, not just between a few policy experts, but rather kind of understood more broadly?
So I actually think that you're doing one of those steps with with like lectures and conference that is going on right now, when we even are talking about these type of things. But I think also that it's important to involve academics and people not only from Lithuania, but maybe people working with these questions on the policy level. Also, like ethical committees and people from different perspectives, and people from the legal field, and as well society like itself, because I think it's important to hear what they think about. But at the same time, I believe it's also important to spread just generally like spread the knowledge about that. So maybe even in the media, talk about it more, not only in one direction, but look at different perspectives, because sometimes we catch one direction and we stick to it.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Tala. Really appreciate you talking with us today and sharing your knowledge with our audience. And as you said, I think this will be great steps towards that broader kind of understanding what neurotech is and how it can be used to kind of understand the human behavior.
Thank you so much, Aruna. Thanks.
Thank you.
Up till now, we talked a lot about the potential of data, what kind of insights it can provide, how it can help guide our decision-making and evidence-based policy. But how can we ensure that we get the right balance between protecting citizens' privacy and having enough data to make decisions? How do we avoid becoming a surveillance state? Let's tune in for the final discussion of the day with Elin Shivo, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, Katarzyna Shimelevich, human rights activist, lawyer, and president of the Panopticon Foundation, moderated by Ramoius Reimers, head of unit at Strata.
Let me welcome everybody to the GovTech Week online conference. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope that we have a really nice digital audience. And today we will have a panel discussion, which is data-driven decision-making, balancing between evidence-based policy and surveillance state. I think that the topic is very it's very interesting and very relevant for the time being of the world, of the technology, and of the whole social structure. So hardly anything runs without data. I think that the data is the new oil, as was titled by The Economist a year or 2 years ago. We see that the rise of the data-driven companies, platforms, even countries, it seems that the data, being the blood in the government's body or a company's body, makes it more agile, more resilient, more open, more entrepreneurial. So today, this panel is dedicated to discuss the extent to which governments should use data. And we have important panelists. I will introduce both panelists right now. We have Ms. Aline Chivon, a senior policy analyst at ITIF, Center for Data Innovation, based in Brussels. Aline focuses on European technology policy issues and on how policy makers can promote digital innovation in the European Union. Prior to joining the Center for Data Innovation, Aline worked for several years in the Netherlands as a policy analyst in the leading think tank, where her work included research projects on defense, security, and economical policy issues. Thank you very much, Aline, for joining us. Very nice to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and we have the second panelist, Ms. Katarzyna Szymelewicz, lawyer specialized in human rights and technology, co-founder and president of Panoptykon Foundation, and Polish NGO defending human rights in the context of surveillance, advisor to European digital rights. From 2011 to 2016, a member of the Council for Digitization in Poland, advising the government. Since 2015, member of Ashoka International Network of Social Entrepreneurs. Very nice having you, Katarzyna, as well in the panel. Hi.
Thank you for your invitation. Looking forward to discussion.
All right, so why we don't start our discussion? So probably just before we start, the distinction has to be made between the socially charged data and personal data and the rest of the data. Because I think having data, it's good. Even having social data, it's good. Data-driven decision-making is good, and accumulating data is good, but having too much data, probably it's not so good anymore. Somewhere there's a line between data and too much data, which we focus our discussion today. So that's probably the balance, the sweet spot where we could start exploring the topic, exploring the balance. And well, generally, what do you think? What is this good amount of having this data to feed the evidence-based policy, and where this line, the red line, which we should not cross, would start? If I could start from Aline, could you please contribute?
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Just real briefly, I'd like to push back a little bit on what you said on data being the new oil. I think the analogy should not necessarily be used the way that it's been. People interpret it to mean that data has become a very valuable commodity in the modern economy. And it's true that data is invaluable, but the analogy with oil is I would say, actually quite flawed. But we can get back to this discussion at another moment, perhaps. I think just to get back to your question on the benefits of data for instance, in policy making, as this is today's discussion, I think this is a no-brainer. New technologies have even made it easier and cheaper to collect and use data, and data leads to better understanding and decision-making among individuals, businesses, governments. Governments, agencies are using data to cut costs, to prioritize social services, to keep citizens safe. They can use data to deliver better services to citizens. We've seen with the COVID crisis how it's been increasingly beneficial to be able to harness the power of data sharing between researchers, academics, and companies and governments to be able to find solutions to the crisis. You have a lot of applications and a lot of institutions that are using data to really make things better. Just a couple more examples. The European Space Agency, they deploy satellites equipped with remote sensing technologies to track and analyze changes in the global environment, to help forecast weather events like hurricanes and droughts. So there's really, I could go on and on with examples, like you can use data for policymaking to promote racial equity, to analyze data with an anti-racism lens, to fight hidden institutional biases in policies and in practices. So you can use data for a lot of positive applications. And governments in this really have to lead by examples. They really can act as a practitioner and help build local data savvy communities, demonstrate the feasibility of different technologies, and encourage public enthusiasm for data-driven innovation. And of course, the problem with many organizations, and especially governments and public sector institutions, is that they've been quite slow to adopt those technologies, and the public sector in particular lags behind in some ways when it comes to really harnessing the potential of data and transitioning towards digital, for several reasons. I mean, they're outsourcing digital, or there's a lack of software culture. There's a risk of civil servants not trusting the work of technologies. And back to your point about how much data is too much, or is there some sort of a gray area here, or some sort of a limit? We know that many algorithms, fortunately or unfortunately, this is another discussion. For now, in order to be accurate, they still feed on data quite a bit. So the more data you can have, the more accurate your technology is likely to be. Now, we can get back to that as well later. One important point in saying that is also not just the quantity is important, but the quality of the data is important. So I would say data is good in quantity, but we also have to make sure that it is properly cleaned, that it is properly shared, that it is properly collected, in order to really find applications that are accurate and beneficial.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, that's the analogy made by The Economist a couple of years ago with the rise of the big tech companies, especially those big four. But probably, yes, the data is not the new oil. It's something even better. And now, Katarzyna, could we have this balance from your side? Because now it seems that we are talking about data that is not socially charged, or just it's not socially sensitive. I mean, everybody would like to have more data about our, I don't know, crops, climate, pollution, and all the metrics that goes around us, because it's not really sensitive. It's not connected with a personal dimension. But some of the data can be connected with a personal dimension. And I believe that's where the problems might start.
Very true. That's a very good point. This distinction between personal data, as we call it in the legal jargon, and non-personal or statistical data describing the world around us, although the line between the two can be blurred and can be very tricky to distinguish where we are in a specific case. Think, for example, about transportation, cars, engines. To what extent data generated by cars are at the same time data of their users that certainly describe the way the machine is used, the way the machine behaves, and the places where the machine goes, therefore revealing quite a lot of personal information, even if at the beginning we could think or we would wish to think that we are just collecting data about the engine of the car, for example. Back for a couple of seconds to the oil analogy, I also think it's quite outdated analogy, and we need better ones. But one aspect of this old analogy still resonates with me, which is negative externalities of processing data. Same way you always have negative externalities for the environment, for human beings, for societies of processing oil, too much oil in particular, and oil extraction always comes with costs. And in a similar way, thinking about data, immaterial and in essence a very different resource than oil, obviously. That's why I think we all criticize this analogy today, but the negative externalities are there, and this is also where the balancing test should start. So I don't think anybody should have a precise answer to when we exceed, when quantity of data becomes too much, because it's very, very contextual, and that balancing test will look differently depending on the purpose. So for example, if we talk about online marketing, a business type of industry that has been extremely data driven and extremely data intensive, I would say for that type of purpose, which is not socially positive, it does not reward people, it does not serve people, it's even questioned by industry itself. There is a lot of research showing how flawed the whole behavioral advertising models are, and how, needless to say, they can be harmful for people, but for the companies themselves, it's even more questionable that they simply don't work. So for something that is socially questionable, potentially harmful for people, and even flawed in its essence, I would say any data is too much data, and that this balancing test will always fail as soon as you see any negative externalities. But if you replace behavioral targeting with curing cancer, doing research on people's behavior to, develop a better methods of treatment or better psychological treatment. So you need behavioral data again, but for entirely different purpose. Now we are talking about a very different test. And so I wouldn't be even trying to identify the point in quantity that makes any sense, because it will always depend. What is less vague, or where we could really put a finger on, is what already Eileen mentioned, quality of data. I think here we have quite strict guidelines already developed by a research community, by academia, by authoritative bodies like British ICO, who issued recently last year very well developed guidelines on explainability of AI, arguing that we should aim for explainable AI whenever decisions affecting humans are present, and building on the amount of knowledge in the field we already have, we can identify certain red lines for the quality of data. So, for example, collecting data that is not relevant to the problem you want to solve should not be the case. If the problem you want to solve is, predict behavior of a convicted person, famous or infamous US example with predictive policing systems, with systems supporting or meant to support judges in making very difficult predictions about human beings. The problem here is relevance. We have scientists argue that it is simply impossible to predict the pattern of behavior for an individual, no matter what kind of data you have, but definitely you cannot do that just looking at historical data from the justice system, because then the best you can achieve is to repeat certain stereotypes, certain patterns of thinking. So irrelevant or confusing data, or data polluted with certain patterns of human thinking can only be dangerous, and collecting more of it will not help us solve the problem. Another aspect is accuracy. Again, Ellen already mentioned that it is quite tricky to collect accurate data about human behavior. It's probably much easier to do that with cars. It's probably easier to do that with crops and weather. But when you discuss human behavior that is contextual, that depends on specific situation, including the very presence of the software collecting data that modifies human behavior by definition, you can very quickly end up with non-accurate, confusing data just because you have introduced a data collection system in the equation that wasn't there before, right? So these would be the parameters I would be looking at when deciding what type of data we need and whether that's always the most important question, whether data can help us solve a specific problem at all. But if the answer, data-driven answer is yes, if we can prove, if there is a proof of concept that indeed we have data to answer a certain question, I agree. Why not use it with safeguards that I believe we will discuss in the next round.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive answer. Yes, please, Aline, just jump in.
Thank you so much. I know it maybe is not conventional, but a lot of the things that you said just made me want to react, if I may. We may not agree on everything, but I think that's for the sake of the discussion, that could be very interesting. So I do concur with a few things you said regarding I think the limits between where personal data begins and ends. So you have mixed data sets in certain situations that have both. In my work, I cover regulatory aspects of tech and legislative proposals of the European Commission, for instance. They came up with this European data strategy, and they are focusing on and even obsessing about data ownership, making sure data portability is going to be expanded, that there should be some common data spaces per sector, so that you facilitate not just the control and access of personal data by individuals themselves, but also facilitate the sharing of industrial data. But here's the catch. If you have a common data space, for instance, for financial services and one for healthcare, we know that these involve inevitably personal data, sensitive data, personal identifiable data. And that will lead to some sort of regulatory schizophrenia between we have the GDPR on the one hand that does limit the collection, use, and repurposing of personal data, and that data strategy that will bring legislative proposals like the Data Acts and others on the table that will incentivize and encourage the sharing and the processing and the repurposing of that data. So that's one point that I wanted to make on really to complement that difficulty and that problem that it will be a problem in terms of legal clarity and certainty for companies in particular, and as to how can they use data. Also, there are many kinds of personal data that individuals themselves does not, cannot, and maybe should not even own. And one reason is that rather than one type of data, there are many millions of different data sets that cover different and unrelated things with different applications. And the pooling, the overlap, the cross-application of these data sets don't always make sense. It's like if you pool cow fertility data with power utility loading metrics and gas turbine telemetry and fortnight cohort analysis that may not be necessarily useful. So that's one thing. And another thing that I wanted to contribute is also when it comes to creating those data spaces and expanding those data portability rights. That has a cost for companies. I mean, data portability is good to some extent, that companies can propose more products, that consumers can maybe access different platforms and keep the same data, and it's in real time, it's much more convenient. But there's not necessarily evidence that consumers want those personal data spaces. And another point is, it's great to want to give more controls to users, individuals, but at the same time, if these people don't have the digital literacy to be able to know how to use those tools, where they are, if there's no guidance next to it, I mean, all these proposals are just going to be paper tigers. And one thing final thing that I wanted to react on that I've heard you touch upon was, this discussion that really goes towards accuracy. I'm hearing maybe bias. And I've just read an op-ed this morning that talked about racist tech. I mean, that was the way it was framed. And I found it to be a little, it really reflects a misunderstanding, at least in my view, when it comes to bias and things like AI and technologies in general that are used just like we would hold humans to the standards of being biased and racist. Algorithmic bias is a tendency of an algorithm to produce results that have significant difference in accuracies in different groups. And if you look at it in that sense, there are many contexts in which algorithmic bias can be actually pretty much acceptable. If I go on Zalando and I buy clothes, my algorithm is biased so that it recommends maybe clothes.
If I can stop you, I think we will discuss it later on, and I haven't made that argument in the context of accuracy. I actually think that algorithmic bias is a solvable issue, and when I meant accuracy, I meant something else, rather simply non-accurate data about humans that modify their behavior as a result of a new factor introduced in the system, and data simply does not show us something that we try to see. I didn't mention bias in this context, so we don't have to discuss it now. I think we can do it later.
Yeah, thanks. Aline, would you like to finish? Yeah, yes.
No, I guess, well, I mean, there's a lot to say about this issue, but we can continue later then.
Well, I think that's very important. It's very interesting because we already have this kind of a real discussion where we can touch probably a common topic from different perspectives and from different point of view, probably. So I think that we do have agreement here that the quality of data probably would be the most important thing. But on the other hand, it was mentioned that the data should be only used if we have a goal, a good, probably good-hearted goal for usage of it. But just think about it, that with the digital uptake, with the Internet of Things, with the wearable technology, and et cetera, I think we are collecting a vast amount of data each second without probably knowing how it might be used further on, because it might be very useful solving very reasonable health issues that we are not trying to solve right now this minute. But having the data in the future, it will allow us to solve it. So maybe the collection of the data, well, probably it's good in itself, and it would not stop. And I was thinking that should the personal data, because now we're really touching this personal data file, that this personal data used for public good, if the personal data is used for public good, maybe it's good, or it should be used for direct personal good as well. If it's my data, should I be the beneficiary of this data that I'm kind of giving up willingly or unwillingly for somebody to use? So Katarzyna, maybe we could start from your reaction back to the previous comments and just a little bit pick up on this as well.
Yes, no, I will start with your question. I think it's moving us forward in this discussion more than my reactions to what has been said before. Indeed, absolutely key question in the whole discussion here is who controls the data. If data is collected and stored just in case it might become useful in the future by private companies with their own commercial interest behind that, then it's not surprising that people are concerned, that governments are concerned, the data protection authorities are concerned. And the first question is, why do you do it? What is your legal purpose? According to GDPR, we always demand companies to indicate specifically their purpose and to go through a certain balancing test of necessity and proportionality. This is already built in the European law. These are old principles. GDPR has only re-established them. It's not invented 2 years ago. So as lawyers, we always look at whether specific data collection is necessary and proportionate for a specific purpose. Having said that, I said this to explain that it's legally, at least in the European law, unthinkable, unjustified to collect data just in case, because it might come handy in the future. If we want to go in this direction, if there is public interest, or there are politicians, decision makers believing there is public interest in doing so, namely in collecting data that we cannot use today, but we might find positive for the society ways of using them in the future, then comes the question how we do it. One way of doing it would be to avoid having this data personal. So collect only data that is either not linked to human beings, not describing individuals, not affecting individuals, or anonymize data using the whole world of knowledge on how to do it right, because anonymization is a tricky beast. It's not easy to effectively anonymize data. I will not go into details because I'm not data scientist myself, but I'm pretty sure that our viewers, listeners know where to find advice on data anonymization and appreciate how difficult it can be, but it can be done. So that's one approach. If on the other hand, if we decide as a society that we want to have personal data stored for the future operations, then comes the whole discussion who should control it. And one of the concepts that in our network of digital rights organizations gains a lot of traction and interest is creating new constructs for this, like data trusts that would be controlled not by companies, not by governments, but by multi-stakeholder bodies that ensure that exactly the level of trust is higher and that potential for abuse is lower. We don't have yet ready legal constructs to introduce data trust in Europe. It is a common law-based concept. So again, it will take some discussion how to transfer it, but that could be an interesting direction. That on one hand, we agreed to take more risk regarding the collection of personal data for the future, but on the other hand, we built in the system legal and technical safeguards preventing or lowering the risk of abusing such data, for example, for narrow-minded short-term commercial purposes. I know it's quite abstract. We're talking on a general level. It would be probably easier to take a case to discuss, but that would be the principle that we discuss in our network. One case that we can look at today and very present in this discussion, I believe, is the COVID-19 and collection of data to help fight a pandemic or at least track the virus. This case has been very useful, at least in my opinion. We've moved in the discussion in Europe from let's collect it all, let's look at personal data, let's employ every technology we have to observe human behavior in this context, to solutions that are very privacy friendly, basically using only anonymous data. I refer now to the standard that was finally adopted by Google and Apple for COVID tracking apps and effectively also imposed on governments. In this standard, you actually don't use personal data because it turned out not to be necessary, right? So even in the context of quite urgent, quite alarming cause, where that appetite for collecting more, storing for the future, maybe for the next pandemic to come, has been curbed by I think quite successful collaboration of data protection authorities, researchers, watchdog organizations like us, and surprisingly also big tech companies that in this particular conversation showed presented social responsibility. And at the end of the day, we have solutions that might be useful. It's not for me to judge, I'm not epidemiologist, and do not expose people's privacy and do not lead to collection of personal data just in case. So that example shows that we can at least try to tackle serious societal challenges without collecting data just in case, especially personal data, unless, as I said before, we find a better legal vehicles for this and effective safeguards preventing risks that will emerge. Undoubtedly, we will have these issues.
Yes, thank you. Aline, would you like to jump in this as well, to continue on that? And I think that another aspect that's already been touched in this question and previous one is GDPR. I think, do you think that's enough for us to have it? I mean, and we can survive in today's world with that?
It's an interesting discussion that we had to have with the crisis, right? So there's been this discussion on how to maintain or strike a balance between using technologies to help tackle health crisis and safeguard privacy at the same time. And I think citizens have really shown that they're willing and ready to make concessions to some of their liberties and freedoms in particular circumstances, but some worry that what we accept during the health crisis may end up integrating the common law, or that data sets could be put to other uses in the future. I think the EUDP has expressed some also concerns regarding, temperature checking in Brussels, etc. So there's really an importance that for these applications to be effective, that there's public trust. And that means that people know that data will be protected by appropriate security measures. And at the same time, you have, and I'm quoting a German politician, and I forgot his name, but he said something like, anyone who makes data protection and health protection something like mutually exclusive options is actually prolonging the crisis at a very high price. So there's this sort of very difficult dilemmas or discussions that have been happening. Now, the European data protection rules, they do limit that processing of personal data, but they do allow for public health exceptions in the context of pandemics with certain limits and safeguards. But not all measures proposed in European countries have necessarily met those limits. So some people would argue that the GDPR is not enough to protect privacy, and that the debate over the use of location data in particular settings, it's really a forerunner to a broader discussion about civil liberties and surveillance. And others have also argued that a lack of a common approach for data sharing would limit and would have limited the ability of researchers to act in the current context. And then you have other examples outside Europe where you have China that has been more extreme on an effective use of the technology at the expense of privacy. Now, we know that we have safeguards in Europe that include pseudonymization, aggregation, encryption, decentralization, but it's true that anonymized data can never be totally anonymous, and in many cases it's not necessarily secure because there is a risk that it can be traced back to personal data, but it is known as one of the common safeguards. So it is true that in some instances, the GDPR, some people are still debating whether that was either a limit to using data in the crisis or, something that was useful to protect certain privacy concerns and safeguards to privacy. I just wanted to maybe get back to the point of some tech companies working with governments. I think what has been an interesting example is this French Stop COVID application. You see that in Finland, actually, the app seems to be, the COVID app seems to be working rather well. I think it's 20% of the population that downloaded the app within the first day. But in France, you see that it's only been sending 70 or so notifications to at-risk users, and very few people have been adopting it. Some people call it a technological caprice, that a lot of money has been wasted and we don't even know when we stop using it, etc. But really the issue isn't about whether or not we should spend resources on these apps. I think they can be useful. It's more about the approach and how countries have gone about in building them. And sometimes the governments and the public sector just isn't necessarily taking reasonable decisions. And strangely enough, you have governments like France or even Germany. They asked companies like Apple and Google to relax their privacy rules on contact tracing and to turn off their privacy protections, which goes against years of European rhetoric casting tech companies as the bad guys when it comes to data privacy. So I think there could have been better decisions made at the level of the public sector, and it shows how much there needs to be some sort of a catch up in that area. One way, just a final point, just as a side note, one way we could definitely increase the collection and use of data for the benefit of individuals, but also businesses, because it's something I focus also on my work, more the innovation side of it, is the use of data trust, because securing, making sure access and sharing of data is secure, cyber secure, but also privacy secure and protects trade secrets. You need to have better infrastructure that enables that exchange. And we still haven't developed that very well in Europe yet. We have the UK that has tested data trusts, so those sort of mechanisms that can really help address issues of data quality, security, and privacy, and protect companies' intellectual property. And I think that could be very useful to encourage private and non-profit sectors to provide voluntary access to high-quality data as well.
Okay, thank you so
May I
much.
react to on the GDPR question as well?
Yes, of course. I just will make a very short comment that this Corona app used in France, actually, I've got a number that it only had alerted 14 people. You said 70, 14, but I mean...
I've read 72.
70, but in any case, I mean, well, that's probably not a huge amount.
No.
Having the population of France, and well, it also brought me thoughts. Does it bring value? I mean, this app, using app, giving up some privacy, and then you have only less than 100 people alert with that. But just
it's valuable if it has critical mass. So the less people adopted,
exactly. Yeah. So it did not pick up. Yes, Katarzyna, please going back to GDPR.
Well, also quickly reacting on apps, since you brought that point. I know it's easy target for all of us to almost laugh at, because this experiment clearly fails in scale. But I can also understand why so many governments took the risk. It was clearly an experiment. Nobody was hiding it at the point in time when these apps were enrolled. The consensus that we have seen emerging in Europe was that since it is experimental, since we don't know what will be the uptake and what will be the impact on actually managing the crisis, therefore, we need to raise the bar for safeguards and protect privacy to the maximum level, exactly to avoid the negative externalities I mentioned before. And if you see this experiment from that perspective, that privacy has not been exposed, that actually people have not been tracked in a way that they are usually tracked online, because these apps are not collecting personal data, right? So they're very different in that aspect from typical online services that we all know and some of us don't like, including myself. If you take that into account, you can look at failed experiment from the perspective of mislocated public money or mislocated time of state authorities, but not privacy, fortunately, wasn't at stake to the extent that it could have been had we have real tracking apps that were contemplated by many governments at the beginning of this conversation. So that's on this is a quick comment on contact tracing apps and this whole experiment. And back to GDPR and your question whether this is enough. Again, in our digital rights network, there is a strong consensus that not. We are still big fans of the GDPR, even if we see that after almost 3 years of that law being in operation, there are still many unsolved questions. Regardless of this observation, we think GDPR should stay in its current form, should not be reopened, because that creates huge political and legislative risks for citizens in particular, because the lobbying power behind further diluting principles would be huge, I think, at that point in time. So I'm not saying at all the GDPR should be reopened as a political project, but fortunately, we have EU aiming with full speed at a different legal reform orientated towards large platforms and solving the specific problems for our privacy, and not only for our privacy, also for democracy, for many other aspects of our life, problems caused by online platforms with specific focus on large platforms. I'm talking about the Digital Services Act and the whole package coming with this legislation. And this is a very good opportunity, together with horizontal AI legislation, to fill certain gaps that we see left after the GDPR reform. And these gaps relate to non-personal data in particular. So as we already, I think, have shown in this discussion, a lot can be done with non-personal data. And non-personal data can be very useful for policymaking. And still there can be questions on securing this data, on the accuracy of this data, on the legitimacy of using this data, on social cost of using also non-personal data. So one area where we need more guidance is non-personal data. For example, whether any company can plug any sensor anywhere in the field or in the forest or in somebody's physical space, in order to collect data or not. These questions need to be solved. On the other hand, algorithmic decision-making that affects human beings is also often driven by non-personal data. So again, my example of online advertising that I specifically criticize because I have strong concerns about this field. Behavioral advertising very often or always is driven by statistical models, by big data that describe not only my behavior, but behavior of other people. But at the end, I am affected by content recommendation that might be confusing for me or abusive, by an ad that might play with my vulnerabilities, by a discriminatory pricing or any other offer that might affect my rights. Even though it was driven by non-personal data, the harm is on me. And these types of situations in a more serious context, like public policy, judiciary decisions, medical decisions, recruitment decisions, can be plenty. So we have to solve this problem, which is not yet solved by the GDPR. And looking at these two areas and probably more, we certainly need more legislation in this area. I'm sorry to say it because I'm also not a big fan of coming up with new regulations, but I think it's a given that we will have new regulations.
Thank you so much. That were very interesting points, I think. Well, we already also touched kind of this public and private collaboration and gathering data and building evidence and, I don't know, using the data for something. And you also touched this in a way that there's a problem. There's a problem probably when the company is not really obliged to, or not really regulated to the full, not to abuse the data. And in some cases, it might happen that a private company might overrun the government in a sense. We saw this happening probably in the United States with some social platforms back in the day. There are some other examples of that. And as I understand, you would say that GDPR kind of misses this regulation in Europe for the time being, with a better proposition of using this, of collecting this data that might be not really attributed to a person, but using it in a ethical sense.
Well, GDPR does not concern non-personal data at all. So it by definition, it cannot solve this problem. This is problem beyond GDPR.
Yes, exactly. Aline, would you like to contribute on that as well?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go back to Katarzyna's point on the GDPR being enough or not, because I think some, at least my organization was one of those that has been arguing for saying how GDPR actually has limited the adoption of tools like those COVID apps. And because according to the GDPR, people have to give their consent to a functionality of an app separately, and that proximity data should or can only be used with the user's consent. And actually leaving it up to individual users to choose to opt in such an app could be a problem, because the only way this type of app, as we discussed, can reach a critical mass and be efficient if enabled by default. So that it facilitates really the collection of that data if we're talking about COVID apps. And other people have been discussing how, you know, the principle of data minimization that we find in the GDPR may lose some of its preeminence after COVID, because now you have in a debate an increasing recognition that access to data is invaluable to protecting public health. So I wonder how that could be opened up for other disease cases. Will it be rolled back for COVID? Will we go back to how it was? Or, you know, will they be really a change in one of those principles of the GDPR, that is data minimization, for example? Now, we did not have a position on this, but I'm just saying that could be something that policymakers and lawmakers will be discussing. And I think regarding did you want me to react to another point that Katarzyna brought up?
Yes, please do.
Because I think, I'm not sure was it about the use of It was some case in the US. I'm not exactly sure. Was it about algorithmic bias this time?
I think the last question was about the companies collecting non-personal data and how that relates to GDPR. But maybe before we go into that question, if you still want to do it, let me react on what Ellen just said about the GDPR, because I think it is important for me as a European lawyer. I have to do it. I have to correct it. Not at all. GDPR has 7 legal grounds where consent is only one of them, and specifically for public uses of data, for health-related uses, we should consider different legal grounds. So this is not true that the only way for a COVID tracing or tracking up to work is through opt-in. Not at all. We can certainly imagine a different legal ground. All it takes is the proportionality and necessity test to be passed. And that was the problem in most of the cases, because we already discussed it, I will not repeat it, how many controversies there are around these apps, to what extent this type of data will be useful or not, to what extent that level of tracing is necessary or not. But if we have these arguments solved, the answer would be yes, then there is no legal controversy with a specific state legislating on an app like this and choosing a different legal ground for such an app, simply saying this is necessary for public health purposes or necessary for any other real reason, and therefore avoiding the individual opt-in. So this is not true that according to GDPR, we need to go through opt-in, not at all. We as GDPR liking lawyers actually argue against this, because we hate the fact how individual consent is abused by companies and sometimes even governments. Let's not be mistaken on this. It's only one of 7 legal grounds and not the most important one.
Okay, thanks. I see that actually we are going already close with the time. So I thought that we have probably a lot of points to discuss here, but I think that it will be already a time to do a closing round. And well, in this case, we would probably need to zoom out of some details that we've been discussing already for almost an hour. And I have an example that I would like you to share your view at. It's about Brazil. It's about Latin America's largest democracy that it was a leader on data governance for many years. Even at 2018, Brazil's Congress passed the data protection law, which they called LGPD. It's closely modeled on European GDPR. And recently, though, the country took a more authoritarian path. Even before the pandemic, they began creating an extensive data collection and surveillance infrastructure. In October 2018, President signed a decree compelling all federal bodies to share most of the data they hold on Brazilian citizens, from health records to biometric information, consolidated in a vast master database, with no public debate, with no public consultation. They took this measure by surprise. So they say that it hopes to increase the quality and consistency of the data it holds. It could improve public services, cut down on voter fraud, reduce bureaucracy. In a country with 210 million people, a system would speed up a delivery of social welfare services, tax benefits, public policies would be more efficient. But on the other hand, critics warned that under the far-right leadership, this concentration of data will be used to abuse personal privacy and civil liberties. And that's happening with the largest democracy in Latin America. Would you share your view on that? Because probably we can have a discussion what's happening here in Europe, but the world is broader than that, and there are more streams of thought, more policies, and more realities than we've been discussing right now. Could you please elaborate on what is happening? Do you see a perspective that many countries would take on this path with current situation of a pandemic, which really gives a power to politicians to act more in a more radical way? I don't know, maybe Eileen, could we start from you with that?
My take on your question would be, In general, I think when you have a crisis in a very uncertain environment and context, and we've seen how freedoms and liberties have been challenged in recent months, I can see how our democratic institutions are more fragile or have been fragilized, and maybe, you know, there is opportunity for certain types of rules to emerge. I mean, we've seen that in Europe as well. The contribution that I can make to your point that maybe is relevant to what I do in my work is that we see that, I mean, some see that sort of push from Europe itself with certain types of regulations, including GDPR, that some companies, that some economic regions don't really like to see emerge. That, you know, we've heard how things like the GDPR or a legal framework for AI with more requirements on certain companies could limit innovation, could limit data flows, and that Brussels is really trying to put a regulatory stamp on many things because it believes that global markets will follow its lead. And I think not everyone is looking at us, you know, with the confidence that it is going in the right direction. And in general, I think government officials don't necessarily spend enough time thinking through the actual practical effect. How much is this regulation? It looks good on paper, but how much is it going to cause the company to implement? What are going to be practical outcomes? What kinds of what is the cost-benefit analysis of bringing in this piece of regulation? What does it mean for the rest of the world? For instance, you have a lot of countries like China, India, Brazil, and Russia moving ahead with data localization as a strategy. And data localization is the enemy of the digital economy because it limits free flow of data, which is not something that it necessarily is good for competitiveness of companies. So I think we have to continue to think we are in a global data market and we're in a global economy that doesn't really know borders. So something that can happen in Brazil or in Europe and it can have an impact on other regions. I hope that answers your question. I wasn't quite sure how to react, but.
Okay, thank you very much. Katarzyna, would you like to collaborate on that as well?
Thank you. Indeed, it is difficult to comment on Brazilian situation without knowing more details about current context. I do remember 5 years back how optimistic we were as the network of digital rights activists about Brazil coming up with GDPR-like legislation. I know a lot has changed in the meantime, but I'm not quite updated with how wrong or how far from the ideal scenario Brazil has moved in terms of legislation. So it's not for me to judge the quality of that legislation. Looking at politics of this country, certainly I would also have concerns whether, no matter what the law applies, whether the government will not abuse the information it has. But this is the never-ending discussion, the never-ending battle we have in each and every democracy. In that sense, the pandemic only fuels the same political process that we've been observing since ever. It's not a new struggle that people need to stay alerted. People need to continue fighting for their rights because nobody else will do it for them. And certainly there will be companies and governments willing to abuse power over data if we give it to them, but we don't have to. Obviously, it's easier said than done when you talk about more authoritarian states, looking at Asia, looking at Russia, not certain, as I said, about Brazil, whether we can put Brazil in the same row, but certainly in authoritarian regimes, I'm not putting any blame on people for not reacting. I understand how limited their ability to act is, and I don't have any clever advice on how to solve this issue because this is entirely beyond our discussion today. I can only say that here in Europe, where we still believe to have democratic processes in place, it is partly on us as citizens to remain interested, to remain in the debate, to remain alerted, and do not fall into easy solutions like let's collect it all because we are so afraid of the pandemic or the next one to come. We really have more back to the title of our discussion, evidence to help us work with this fear, work with this easy emotions, and question certain premises. I think COVID-19 was a very good case showing how that shift in the discussion was possible. Yes, we started with this concept, data will save us, AI will save us, let's feed it with more data, but quite quickly, these premises have been questioned, have been undermined. Effectively, we implemented solutions across Europe that are quite privacy friendly, that do not collect everything that could have been collected. So even within this last 6 months, we have learned something, right? Which shows that democracy has certain mechanisms built in order to prevent this negative scenario that you described talking about Brazil. But really, I cannot make any judgments on to what extent Brazilian society currently is in place to put up such a fight and put reasonable limitations on the data collection that happens there.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, probably I took it by surprise asking this question, but probably what I was looking for from both of you is reassurance that, well, Europe can be in a good democratic path of these issues. Please, Aline.
Yeah, because maybe your question was also about whether, because we have the GDPR, we can make sure that we, I mean, the EU wants to make sure it holds countries to its own standards. So will it do the same perhaps with Brazil, if that's maybe a reaction that we want the EU to have? But I would like to be a bit provocative here, because I know there's been this, you know, it's a difficult thing that's happening with the US-EU Privacy Shield on the grounds that the US government would be using personal data of Europeans for surveillance purposes, and so that the US wouldn't necessarily be up to the GDPR standards. But what is interesting is the EU has adequacy with a few countries, has given adequacies to a few countries. It's a long process, it's uncertain. Even the UK is not sure to be granted adequacy, even though it is, you know, as an ex-EU member, it has been implementing and respecting the GDPR. And at the same time, you have Israel that has adequacy, but the country recently came under fire because they've allowed the police to use Israel's anti-terrorism location tracking system to track COVID-positive individuals' mobile phones without their consent. And the EU hasn't necessarily said, well, maybe we should reconsider or reevaluate Israel for adequacy. At least I haven't heard. And then you also have the GDPR that allows companies to transfer EU data to China using legal mechanisms like binding corporate rules and standard contractual clauses, even though companies are subjected to laws like China's national intelligence law that can force them to hand over data to the Chinese government. So I think there's maybe some sort of double standards here and there. The EU is not necessarily consistent with the way in which it implements the GDPR. So I don't know whether, and I don't know again as well, I don't know either enough about the Brazil example, but if maybe that's a 2 cents that I can bring to the table.
We had a very good discussion. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for tuning in for the third day of the GovTech Week. I hope today showed you the potential use of data and technology for policy making and also its limitations. Tomorrow, we will discuss the effect of technology on democracy. How has digital tools changed protests in Belarus? How do we organize as citizens in a digital world? We will discuss how political deliberation can be brought closer to the citizens by technology. Look for the link to tomorrow's live stream in your email or GovTech Week Facebook event. See you tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. GMT +3 time zone. Bye-bye for now.